house in Preston to an artist in his family, for Belinda would not let Gordon sell it. Gordon worked intensively, happily, on the museum project. Kevin was 6 and Melanie was 8. Melanie found London intimidating, but Kevin loved it. Both of the children were initially distressed to have lost their friends and their school. Belinda found a part-time job at a small animal clinic in Camden, working 3 afternoons a week. She missed her camp. Days in London became months, and then years. And despite occasional budgetary setbacks, Gordon was increasingly excited. The day approached when the first ground would be broken for the museum. One night, Belinda woke in the small hours, and she stared at her sleeping husband in the sodium-yellow illumination of the street lamp outside their bedroom window. His hairline was receding, and the hair at back was thinning. Belinda wondered what it would be like when she was actually married to a bald man. She decided it would be much the same as it had always been. Mostly happy, mostly good. She wondered what was happening to the them in the envelope. She could feel its presence, dry and brooding, in the corner of their bedroom, safely locked away from all harm. She felt, suddenly, sorry for the Belinda and Gordon trapped in the envelope on their piece of paper, hating each other and everything else. Gordon began to snore. She kissed him quietly on the cheek and said, "Shh." He stirred and was quiet, but did not wake. She snuggled against him and soon fell back into sleep herself. After lunch the following day, while in conversation with an importer of Tuscan marble, Gordon looked very surprised and reached a hand up to his chest. He said, "I'm frightfully sorry about this." And then his knees gave way, and he fell to the floor.
Spider shirt.
They called an ambulance, but Gordon was dead.
Spooky spiders all over it.
He was 36 years old. At the inquest, the coroner announced that the autopsy showed Gordon's heart to have been congenitally weak. It could have gone at any time. For the first 3 days
mushroom
after
shirt. I think that spider
Belinda
shirt's
felt
too scary.
a profound
I'd wear this one.
and awful nothing. She comforted the children. She spoke to her friends and to Gordon's
And
friends,
this is
to
the
her family
back.
and to Gordon's family, accepting their condolences gracefully and gently as one accepts unasked-for gifts. She would listen to people cry for Gordon, which she still had not done. She would say all the right things, and she would feel nothing at all. Melanie, who was 11, seemed to be taking it well. Kevin abandoned his books and computer games and sat in his bedroom, staring out of the window, not wanting to talk. The day after the funeral, her parents went back to the countryside, taking both the children with them. Belinda refused to go. There was, she said, too much to do. On the 4th day after the funeral, she was making the double bed that she and Gordon had shared, and she began to cry. And the sobs ripped through her in huge, ugly spasms of grief, and tears fell from her face onto the bedspread, and clear snot streamed from her nose, and she sat down on the floor suddenly, like a marionette whose strings had been cut, and she cried for the best part of an hour, for she knew that she would never see him again. She wiped her face. Then she unlocked her jewelry drawer and took out the envelope and opened it. She pulled out the cream-colored sheet of paper and ran her eyes over the neatly typed words. The Belinda, on the paper, had crashed their car while drunk and was about to lose her driving license. She and Gordon had not spoken for days.
So I'm doing the
He had
second
lost his
layer
job
on
almost
this.
18 months earlier,
I
and
did
now
the
spent
first layer
most of
the
his
other
days
night.
sitting around their house in Salford.
And then I put it in
Belinda's
dye,
job
and
brought in
now
what money they had.
this will be the last
Melanie
layer. And then
was
I'll put
out of
another dye,
control.
put it in another dye bath.
Belinda, cleaning Melanie's bedroom, had found a cache of £5 and £10 notes. Melanie had offered no explanation for how an 11-year-old girl had come by the money, had just retreated into her room and glared at them, tight-lipped when quizzed. Neither Gordon nor Belinda had investigated further, scared of what they might have discovered. The house in Salford was dingy and damp, such that the plaster was coming away from the ceiling in huge, crumbling chunks, and all three of them had developed nasty bronchial coughs. Belinda felt sorry for them. She put the paper back in the envelope. She wondered what it would be like to hate Gordon, to have him hate her. She wondered what it would be like not to have Kevin in her life, not to see his drawings of airplanes or hear his magnificently tuneless renditions of popular songs. She wondered where Melanie, the other Melanie, not her Melanie, but the there but for the grace of God Melanie, could have got that money, and was relieved that her own Melanie seemed to have few interests beyond ballet and Enid Blyton books. She missed Gordon so much. It felt like something sharp being hammered into her chest, a spike, perhaps, or an icicle made of cold and loneliness, and the knowledge that she would never see him again in this world. Then she took the envelope downstairs to the lounge, where the coal fire was burning in the grate because Gordon had loved open fires. He said that a fire gave a room life. She disliked coal fires, but she had lit it this evening out of routine and out of habit, and because not lighting it would have meant admitting to herself on some absolute level that he was never coming home. Belinda stared into the fire for some time, thinking about what she had in her life and what she had given up, and whether it would be worse to love someone who was no longer there, or not to love someone who was. And then, at the end, almost casually, she tossed the envelope onto the coals. And she watched it curl and blacken and catch, watched the yellow flames dancing amidst the blue. Soon the wedding present was nothing but black flakes of ash, which danced on the updrafts and were carried away, like a child's letter to Santa Claus, up the
This is the
chimney and off
picture
into the
I
night.
am doing on this shirt.
Belinda sat back in her chair
Queen of Wands.
and closed her eyes and waited for the
This is a
smile
custom
to
order.
blossom on her cheek. And that is the story I did not write for my friend's wedding. Although, of course, it's not the story I did not write, or even the story I set out to write when I began it some pages ago. The story I thought I was setting out to write was much shorter, much more fable-like, and it did not end like that. I don't know how it did end originally anymore. There was some kind of ending, but once the story was underway, the real ending became inevitable. Most of the stories in this volume have that much in common. The place they arrived at, in the end, was not the place I was expecting them to go when I set out. Sometimes the only way I know that a story had finished was when there weren't any more words to be written down. Reading the entrails. A rondel. Editors who ask me for stories about anything you want, honest, anything at all, just write the story you always wanted to write, rarely get anything at all. In this case, Lawrence Schimmel wrote asking for a poem to introduce his anthology of stories about foretelling the future. He wanted one of the verse forms with repeating lines, like a villanelle or a pantoum, to echo the way we inevitably arrive at our future. So I wrote him a rondel about the pleasures and perils of fortune-telling, and prefaced it with the bleakest joke in Through the Looking Glass. Somehow it seemed a fine starting point for this book. Chivalry. I'd been having a bad... The script I was meant to be writing just wasn't happening, and I'd spent days staring at a blank screen, occasionally writing a word like the, and staring at it for an hour or so, and then slowly, letter by letter, I'd delete it and write and or but instead. Then I did without saving. Ed Kramer phoned and reminded me that I owed him a story for an anthology of stories about the Holy Grail, which he was editing with the ubiquitous Marty Greenberg. And seeing nothing else was happening, and that this story was living in the back of my mind, I said sure. I wrote it in a weekend, a gift from the gods, easy and sweet as anything. Suddenly I was a writer transformed. I laughed in the face of danger and spat on the shoes of writer's block. Then I sat and stared glumly at a blank screen for another week, because the gods have a sense of humour. Several years ago, on a signing tour, someone gave me a copy of an academic paper on feminist language theory that compared and contrasted Chivalry, Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott, and a Madonna song. I hope one day to write a story called Mrs. Whittaker's Werewolf, and wonder what sort of papers that might provoke. When I do live readings, I tend to start with this story. It's a very friendly story, and I enjoy reading it aloud. Nicholas was. Every Christmas, I get cards from artists. They paint them themselves or draw them. They are things of beauty, monuments to inspired creativity. Every Christmas, I feel insignificant and embarrassed and talentless. So I wrote this one year, wrote it early for Christmas. Dave McKean calligraphed it elegantly, and I sent it out to everyone I could think of. My card. It's exactly 100 words long, 102 including the title, and first saw print in Drabble 2, a collection of 100-word-long short stories. I keep meaning to do another Christmas card story, but it's always December the 15th before I remember, so I put it off until next year. The price. My literary agent, Miss Merrily Heifetz of New York, is one of the coolest people in the world, and she has only once, to the best of my recollection, ever suggested that I should write a specific book. This was some time ago.
I'm gonna leave the
Listen,
eyes
she said, angels are big these days, and
in
people
this
always like
shadow
books
here
about
because I'm
cats.
gonna put it in
So I
another
thought,
dye bath.
wouldn't
It's
it be
gonna be
cool if someone did
brown
a book
or
about
dark
a cat
gold.
who was an angel, or an angel who was a cat, or
Let's
something?
do the sleeves.
And I agreed that it was a solid commercial idea and that I would think about it. Unfortunately, by the time I had finally finished thinking about it,
This is
books
the
about angels were a year
chalice.
before last year's thing. Still, the idea was planted, and one day I wrote this story. For the curious, eventually a young lady fell in love with a black cat, and he went to live with her, and the last time I saw him, he was the size of a very small mountain lion, and for all I know, he's growing still. 2 weeks after the black cat left, a brown tabby arrived and moved onto the porch. As I write this, he's asleep on the back of the sofa, a few feet away from me. While I think of it, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my family for letting me put them in this story, and more importantly, both for leaving me alone to write, and for sometimes insisting I come out to play. Trollbridge. This story was nominated for a 1994 World Fantasy Award, although it didn't win. It was written for Ellen Datlow and Terry Windling's Snow White, Blood Red, an anthology of retellings of fairy tales for adults. I chose the tale of the three billy goats graph. Had Gene Wolfe, one of my favourite writers, and it occurs to me now, another person who hid a story in an introduction, not taken the title many years earlier, I would have called it Trip Trap. Don't Ask Jack. Lisa Snellings is a remarkable sculptor. This was written about the first of her sculptures I saw and fell in love with, a demonic jack-in-the-box. She gave me a copy of it and has promised me the original in her will, she says. Each of her sculptures is like a story, frozen in wood or plaster. There is one on my mantelpiece of a winged girl in a cage, offering passers-by a feather from her wings while her captor sleeps. I suspect that this one is a novel. We'll see. The Goldfish Pool and Other Stories. The mechanics of writing fascinate me. This story was begun in 1991. 3 pages were written, and then, feeling too close to the material, I abandoned it. Finally, in 1994, I decided to finish it for an anthology to be edited by Janet Berner and David Copperfield. I wrote it higgledy-piggledy on a battered Atari portfolio palm top, on planes and in cars and hotel rooms, all out of order, jotting down conversations and imaginary meetings until I was fairly sure it was all written. Then I put the material I had in order and was astonished and delighted that it worked. Some of this story is true. Triptych. Eton. Scenes from a moving picture. The White Road. Queen of Knives. Over a period of several months, a few years ago, I wrote 3 narrative poems. Each story was about violence, about men and women, about love. The first of the 3 to be written was a treatment for a pornographic horror movie written in strict iambic pentameter, which I called Eton, Scenes from a Moving Picture. It was fairly extreme, and I'm afraid is not to be found in this volume. The second was a retelling of a number of old English folk tales called The White Road. It was as extreme as the stories it was based on. The last to be written was a tale about my maternal grandparents and about stage magic. It was less extreme, but I hope just as disturbing as the 2 stories that preceded it in the sequence. I was proud of all 3 of them. The vagaries of publishing meant they were actually published over a period of years, so each of them made it into a best of the year anthology. All 3 of them were picked up in the American Year's Best Fantasy and Horror, 1 in British Year's Best Horror, and 1, somewhat to my surprise, was solicited for an international Best Erotica collection. The White Road. There are 2 stories that have both haunted and disturbed me over the years, stories that have attracted and repelled me ever since I encountered them as a small boy. One of them is the tale of Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. The other is the tale of Mr. Fox. It's a sort of English version of Bluebeard. The versions in this retelling of the story were inspired by variants on the tale I found in the Penguin Book of English Folk Tales, edited by Neil Phillip, the story of Mr. Fox, and the notes that follow it, and a version of the tale called Mr. Foster, where I found the image of the White Road, and the way that the girl's suitor marked the trail down the White Road to his gruesome house. In the story of Mr. Fox, the refrain, "It was not so, it is not so, and God forbid it should be so," is repeated as a litany through the recounting of each horror that Mr. Fox's fiancée claims she saw in a dream. At the end, she throws down the bloody finger or the hand that she took from his house and proves that everything she said was true, and then his story is effectively over. It's also about all the strange Chinese and Japanese folk tales, in which ultimately everything comes down to foxes. Queen of Knives. This, like my graphic novel Mr. Punch, is close enough to the truth that I have had on occasion to explain to some of my relatives that it didn't really happen. Well, not like that, anyway. Changes. Lisa Tuttle phoned me one day to ask me for a story for an anthology she was editing about gender. I have always loved science fiction as a medium, and when I was young, I was certain that I would grow up to be a science fiction writer. I never really did. When I first had the idea for this story almost a decade ago, it was a set of linked short stories that would have formed a novel exploring the world of gender reflection. But I never wrote any of those stories. When Lisa called, it occurred to me that I could take the world I'd imagined and tell its story in the same way that Eduardo Galeano told the history of the Americas in his Memory of Fire trilogy. Once I'd finished the story, I showed it to a friend, who said it read like an outline for a novel. All I could do was congratulate her on her perspicacity, but Lisa Tuttle liked it. So do I. The Daughter of Owls. John Aubrey, the 17th century collector and historian, is one of my favourite writers. His writings contain a potent mixture of credulity and erudition, of anecdote, reminiscence, and conjecture. Reading Aubrey's work, one gets an immediate sense of a real person talking from the past in a way that transcends the centuries. An enormously likable, interesting person. Also, I like his spelling.
Under the sleeve.
I tried writing this story in a couple of different ways, but I was never satisfied with it. Then it occurred to me to write it as by Aubrey. Shoggoth's Old Peculiar. The overnight train to Glasgow from London is a sleeper that gets in at about 5 in the morning. When I got off the train, I walked to the station hotel and went inside. I intended to walk down the hall to the reception desk and get a room, then get some more sleep. And then once everyone was up and about, I planned to spend the next couple of days at the science fiction convention that was being held in the hotel. Officially, I was covering it for a national newspaper. On the way down the hall to the reception desk, I passed the bar, empty but for a bemused barman, and an English fan named John Jarrold, who was the fan guest of honor at the convention, had been given an open bar tab, which he was using while others slept. So I stopped to talk to John, and never actually made it to the reception desk. We spent the next 48 hours chatting, telling jokes and stories, and enthusiastically massacring all we could remember of Guys and Dolls in the small hours of the next morning when the bar had started to empty out again. At one point in that bar, I had a conversation with the late Richard Evans, an English science fiction editor that 6 years later would start to turn into Neverwhere. I no longer remember quite why John and I began talking about Cthulhu in the voices of Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, nor why I decided to start lecturing John on H.P. Lovecraft's prose style. I suspect it had something to do with lack of sleep. These days, John Jarrold is a respectable agent and a bastion of the British publishing industry. Some of the middle bits of this story began life in that bar, with John and I doing Pete and Dud as creatures out of H.P. Lovecraft. Mike Ashley was the editor who cajoled me into making them a story. Virus. This was written for David Barrett's Digital Dreams, a computer fiction anthology. I don't play many computer games anymore. When I did, I noticed they tended to take up areas of my head. Blocks fell, or little men ran and jumped behind my eyelids as I went to sleep. Mostly, I'd lose, even when playing with my mind. This came from that. Looking for the Girl. This story was commissioned by Penthouse for their 20th anniversary issue, January 1985. For the previous couple of years, I'd been surviving as a young journalist on the streets of London by interviewing celebrities for Penthouse and Knave, two English skin magazines, tamer by far than their American equivalents. It was an education, all things considered. I asked a model once if she felt she was being exploited. Me, she said. Her name was Marie. I'm getting well paid for it, love, and it beats working the night shift in a Bradford biscuit factory. But I'll tell you who's being exploited. All those blokes who buy it, wanking over me every month. They're being exploited. I think this story began with that conversation. I was satisfied with this story when I wrote it. It was the first fiction I had written that sounded in any way like me, and that didn't read like me doing someone else. I was edging toward a style. To research the story, I sat in the Penthouse UK Docklands offices and thumbed through 20 years' worth of bound magazines.
Listening to
In the
Neil
first Penthouse
Gaiman.
was my friend Dean Smith. Dean did makeup for Knave, and
Writer?
it turned out she'd
don't
been the
know.
very first Penthouse Pet of the Year in 1965. I stole the 1965 Charlotte blurb directly from Dean's blurb, resurgent individualist and all. The last I heard, Penthouse was hunting for Dean for their 25th anniversary celebrations. She'd dropped out of sight. It was in all the newspapers. It occurred to me, while I was looking at 2 decades of Penthouses, that Penthouse and magazines like it had absolutely nothing to do with women, and absolutely everything to do with photographs of women. Then that was the other place the story began. Only the end of the world again. Steve Jones and I had been friends for 15 years. We even edited a book of nasty poems for kids together. This means that he gets to ring me up and say things like, "I'm doing an anthology of stories set in H.P. Lovecraft's fictional town of Innsmouth. Do me a story." This story came from a number of things coming together. That's where we writers get our ideas, in case you were wondering. One of them was the late Roger Zelazny's book, A Night in the Lonesome October, which has tremendous fun with the various stock characters of horror and fantasy. Roger had given me a copy of his book a few months before I came to write this story, and I'd enjoyed it enormously. At about the same time, I was reading an account of a French werewolf trial held 300 years ago. I realized while reading the testimony of one witness that the account of this trial had been an inspiration for Saki's wonderful story, Gabrielle Ernest, and also for James Branch Cabell's short novel, The White Robe. But that both Saki and Cabell had been too well brought up to use the throwing up the fingers motif, a key piece of evidence in the trial, which meant that it was now all up to me. Larry Talbot was the name of the original Wolfman, the one who met Abbott and Costello. Beowulf. And there was that man Steve Jones again. "I want you to write one of your story poems for me. It needs to be a detective story set in the near future. Maybe you could use the Larry Talbot character from Only the End of the World Again?" It happened that I had just finished co-writing a screen adaptation of Beowulf, the Old English narrative poem, and was mildly surprised by the number of people who, mishearing me, seemed to think I had just written an episode of Baywatch. So I began retelling Beowulf as a futuristic episode of Baywatch. For the anthology of detective stories, it seemed to be the only sensible thing to do. Look, I don't give you grief over where you get your ideas from. We can get them for you wholesale. If the stories in this book were arranged in chronological order, rather than in the strange and haphazard, well, it feels right, sort of order I put them in, this story would be the first in the book. I dozed off one night in 1983 listening to the radio. When I fell asleep, I was listening to a piece on buying in bulk. When I woke up, they were talking about hired killers. That was where this story came from. I'd been reading a lot of John Collier short stories before I wrote this. Rereading it several years ago, I realized that it was a John Collier story. Not as good as any good John Collier story, nor written as well as Collier wrote, but it's still a Collier story for all that. And I hadn't noticed that when I was writing it. One Life furnished an early Moorcock. When I was asked to write a story for an anthology of Michael Moorcock's Elric stories, I chose to write a story about a boy
How did I sign it?
and his relationship with fiction. I doubted I could say anything about Elric that wasn't pastiche, but when I was 12, Moorcock's characters were as real to me as anything else in my life, and a great deal more real than, well, geography lessons for a start. "Of all the anthology stories, I liked your story, and Ted Williams is the best," said Michael Moorcock when I ran into him in New Orleans several months after finishing the story. "And I liked his better than yours because it had Jimi Hendrix in it." The title is stolen from a Harlan Ellison short story. Cold Cuts.
My thing here.
I've worked in a number of different media over the years. Sometimes
It's only
people
second
ask
time
me
I'm doing
how
this.
I know what medium an idea belongs to. Mostly they turn up.
Doing a
as
live,
comics or
that
films
is.
or poems or prose or
Been in
novels or
Batik
short
for
stories or whatever. You know what you're writing ahead of
quite a
time.
few years.
This, on the other hand, was just an idea. I wanted to say something about those infernal machines, computers, and black magic, and something about the London I observed in the late 80s, a period of financial excess and moral bankruptcy. It didn't seem to be a short story or a novel, so I tried it as a poem, and it did just fine. For the Time Out Book of London Short Stories, I reformatted it as prose and left a lot of readers very puzzled. The Sweeper of Dreams. This one began with a Lisa Snelling statue of a man leaning on a broom. He was obviously some kind of janitor. I wondered what kind. and that was where the story came from. Foreign Parts. This is another early story. I wrote it in 1984, and I did the final draft, a hasty coat of paint and some grouting in the nastiest cracks, in 1989. In 1984, I couldn't sell it. The science fiction mags didn't like the sex mags didn't like the disease. In 1987, I was asked if I would sell it to an anthology of sexual science fiction stories, but I declined. In 1984, I had written a story about a venereal disease. The same story seemed to say different things. In 1987, the story itself might not have changed, but the landscape around it had altered mightily. I'm talking about AIDS here. And so, whether I had intended it or not, was the story. If I was going to rewrite the story, I was going to have to take AIDS into account. And I couldn't. It was too big, too unknown, too hard to get a grip on. But by 1989, the cultural landscape had shifted once more, shifted to the point where I felt, if not comfortable, then less uncomfortable, about taking the story out of the cabinet, brushing it down, wiping the smudges off its face and sending it out to meet the nice people. So when editor Steve Niles asked if I had anything unpublished for his anthology, Words Without Pictures, I gave him this. I could say that it wasn't a story about AIDS, but I'd be lying, at least in part. And these days, AIDS seems to have become, for good or evil, just another disease in Venus's armory. Really, I think it's mostly about loneliness and identity, and perhaps it's about the joys of making your own way in the world. Vampire Sestina. My only successful Sestina, a verse form in which the last word of each of the first 6 lines repeat in ever-changing sequence over the next verses and in one 3-line end piece. First published in Fantasy Tales and reprinted in Steve Jones's Mammoth Book of Vampires. For years, this was my only piece of vampire fiction. Mouse. This story was written for the Pete Crowther edited Touch Wood, an anthology about superstitions. I'd always wanted to write a Raymond Carver short story. He made it look so easy. Writing this story taught me that it wasn't. I'm afraid I actually did hear the radio broadcast mentioned in the text. The Sea Change. I wrote this in the top flat of a tiny mews house in Earl's Court. It was inspired by a Lisa Snelling statue and by the memory of the beach at Portsmouth when I was a boy, the dragging rattle that the sea makes as the waves pull back over the pebbles. I was writing the last part of Sandman at the time, which was called The Tempest, and bits of Shakespeare's play rattle through this as well, just as it rattled through my head back then. When We Went to See the End of the World by Dawny Morningside, aged 11 1/4. Alan Moore, who is one of the finest writers and one of the finest people I know, and I sat down one day in Northampton and began talking about creating a place that we would want to set stories in. This story is set in that place. One day the good burghers and honest townsfolk of Northampton will burn Alan as a warlock, and it will be a great loss to the world. Desert Wind. One day, a cassette tape arrived from Robin Anders, best known as drummer for Boiled in Lead, with a message telling me that he wanted me to write something about one of the tracks on the tape. It was called Desert Wind. This is what I wrote. Tastings. This story took me 4 years to write. Not because I was honing and polishing every adjective, but because I'd get embarrassed. I'd write a paragraph, and then I'd leave the story alone until the red flush had faded from my cheeks. And 4 or 5 months later, I'd go back and write another paragraph. I began writing the story for Ellen Datlow's Off Limits Tales of Alien Sex, an erotic science fiction anthology. I missed the deadline for that, carried on writing it for the sequel, Managed about another page or so before I missed the deadline for that as well. Somewhere in there, I phoned Ellen Datlow up and warned her that in the event of my untimely death, there was a half-finished pornographic short story on my hard drive in a file called Datlow, and that it was nothing personal. 2 more Anthology deadlines came and went, and 4 years from the first paragraph, I finished it, and Ellen Datlow and her partner in crime, Terry Windling, took it for Sirens, their collection of erotic fantasy stories. Most of this story came about from wondering why people in fiction never seem to talk while making love, or even while having sex. I don't think that it's erotic, but once the story was finally finished, I stopped finding it embarrassing. Baby Cakes.
Another hand.
A fable, written for a publication to benefit people for the ethical treatment of animals. I think it makes its point. It's the only thing I've ever written that has disturbed me. Last year I came downstairs to find my son Michael listening to Warning Contains Language, a spoken word CD. Baby Cakes started as I arrived, and it caught me by surprise when I heard a voice I scarcely recognized as my own, reading this aloud. For the record, I wear a leather jacket and used to eat meat, but I'm quite good with babies. Murder mysteries. When I had the idea for this story, it was called City of Angels. But around the time I actually began to write it, a Broadway show with that title appeared. So when the story was finished, I gave it a new name. Murder Mysteries was written for Jessie Horsting at Midnight Graffiti magazine for her paperback anthology, also called, coincidentally, Midnight Graffiti. Pete Atkins, to whom I faxed draft after draft as I wrote and rewrote it, was invaluable as a sounding board and a paragon of patience and good humor. I tried to play fair with the detective part of the story. There are clues everywhere. There's even one in the title. Snow Glass Apples. This is another story that began life in Neil Phillips's The Penguin Book of English Folk Tales. I was reading it in the bath, and I read a story I must have read 1,000 times before. I still have the illustrated version of the story I owned when I was 3. But that 1,001st reading was the charm, and I started to think about the story, all back to front and wrong way around. It sat in my head for a few weeks, and then, on a plane, I began to write the story in longhand. When the plane landed, the story was 3/4 done, so I checked into my hotel and sat in a chair in a corner of my room and just kept writing until it was done. It was published by Dreamhaven Press in a limited edition booklet that benefited the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, an organization that defends the First Amendment rights of comics creators, publishers, and retailers. Poppy Z. Bright reprinted it in her anthology, Love in Vain 2. I like to think of this story as a virus. Once you've read it, you may never be able to read the original story in the same way again. I'd like to thank Greg Ketter, whose Dreamhaven Press published several of these stories in Angels and Visitations, a small press miscellany of fiction, book reviews, journalism, and stuff I'd written, and who published others as 2 chapbooks to benefit the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. I want to thank the multitude of editors who commissioned, accepted, and reprinted the various stories in this book, and to all the beta testers, you know who you are, who put up with my handing them, faxing them, or emailing them stories, and who read what I sent them and told me, often in no uncertain terms, what needed fixing. To them all, my thanks. Jennifer Hershey shepherded this book from an idea to reality with patience, charm, and editorial wisdom. I cannot thank her enough. Each of these stories is a reflection of, or on, something, and is no more solid than a breath of smoke. They're messages from Looking Glass Land and pictures in the shifting clouds. Smoke and mirrors. That's all they are.
And
But
this takes a
I
lot
enjoyed
of
watching
wax on
And they,
the XL.
in their turn, I like to imagine, appreciate being read. Welcome, Neil Gaiman. December 1997. Chivalry. Mrs. Whittaker found the Holy Grail. It was under a fur coat. Every Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Whittaker walked down to the post office to collect her pension, even though her legs were no longer what they were. And on the way back home, she'd stop in at the Oxfam shop and buy herself a little something. The Oxfam shop sold old clothes, knickknacks, oddments, bits and bobs, and large quantities of old paperbacks, all of them donations. Second-hand flotsam, often the house clearances of the dead. All the profits went to charity. The shop was staffed by volunteers. The volunteer on duty this afternoon was Marie, 17, slightly overweight, and dressed in a baggy mauve jumper which looked like she'd bought it from the shop. Marie sat by the till with a copy of Modern Woman magazine, filling out a Reveal Your Hidden Personality questionnaire. Every now and then, she'd flip to the back of the magazine and check the relative points assigned to an A, B, or C answer, before making up her mind how she'd respond to the question. Mrs. Whittaker potted around the shop. They still hadn't sold the stuffed cobra, she noted. It had been there for 6 months now, gathering dust, glass eyes gazing balefully at the clothes racks and the cabinet filled with chipped porcelain and chewed toys. Mrs. Whittaker patted its head as she went past. She picked out a couple of Mills and Boon novels from a bookshelf. Her Thundering Soul and Her Turbulent Heart, a shilling each, and gave careful consideration to the empty bottle of Matthias Rosé with a decorative lampshade on it before deciding she really didn't have anywhere to put it. She moved a rather threadbare fur coat, which smelled badly of mothballs. Underneath it was a walking stick and a water-stained copy of Romance and Legend of Chivalry by A.R. Hope Moncrief, priced at 5 pence. Next to the book, on its side, was the Holy Grail. It had a little round paper sticker on the base, and written on it, in felt pen, was the price, 30p. Mrs. Whittaker picked up the dusty silver goblet and appraised it through her thick spectacles. "This is nice," she called to Marie. Marie shrugged. "It'd look nice on the mantelpiece." Marie shrugged again. Mrs. Whittaker gave 50 pence to Marie, who gave her 10 pence change and a brown paper bag to put the books and the Holy Grail in. Then she went next door to the butcher's and bought herself a nice piece of liver. Then she went home. The inside of the goblet was thickly coated with a brownish-red dust. Mrs. Whittaker washed it out with great care, then left it to soak for an hour in warm water with a dash of vinegar added. Then she polished it with metal polish until it gleamed, and she put it on the mantelpiece in her parlour, where it sat between a small, soulful china basset hound and a photograph of her late husband Henry on the beach at Frinton in 1953. She had been right. It did look nice. For dinner that evening, she had the liver fried in breadcrumbs with onions. It was very nice. The next morning was Friday. On alternate Fridays, Mrs. Whittaker and Mrs. Greenberg would visit each other. Today it was Mrs. Greenberg's turn to visit Mrs. Whittaker. They sat in the parlour and ate macaroons and drank tea. Mrs. Whittaker took 1 sugar in her tea, but Mrs. Greenberg took sweetener, which she always carried in her handbag, in a small plastic container.
Okay.
"That's nice,"
Sleeve.
said Mrs. Greenberg, pointing to the Grail. "What is it?" "It's the Holy Grail," said Mrs. Whittaker. "It's the cup that Jesus drank out of at the Last Supper. Later, at the crucifixion, it caught his precious blood when the centurion's spear pierced his side." Mrs. Greenberg sniffed. She was small and Jewish and didn't hold with unsanitary things. "I wouldn't know about that," she said, "but it's very nice. Our Myron got one just like that when he won the swimming tournament, only it's got his name on the side." "Is he still with that nice girl, the hairdresser?" "Bernice? Oh, yes. They're thinking of getting engaged," said Mrs. Greenberg. "That's nice," said Mrs. Whittaker. She took another macaroon Mrs. Greenberg baked her own macaroons and brought them over every alternate Friday. Small, sweet, light brown biscuits with almonds on top. They talked about Myron and Bernice, and Mrs. Whittaker's nephew Ronald, she had no children, and about their friend Mrs. Perkins, who was in hospital with her hip, poor dear. At midday, Mrs. Greenberg went home, and Mrs. Whittaker made herself cheese on toast for lunch. And after lunch, Mrs. Whittaker took her pills, the white and the red and the two little orange ones. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Whittaker answered the door. It was a young man, with shoulder-length hair so fair it was almost white, wearing gleaming silver armor with a white surcoat. "Hello," he said. "Hello," said Mrs. Whittaker. "I'm on a quest," he said. "That's nice," said Mrs. Whittaker non-committally. "Can I come in?" he asked. Mrs. Whittaker shook her head. "I'm sorry, I don't think so," she said.
The front,
"I'm
the
on a quest for the
sun,
Holy Grail," the young man
the
said.
hands,
"Is it here?
wrapping around.
Have you got any
Okay,
identification?"
let's do the back.
Mrs. Whittaker asked. She knew that it was unwise to let unidentified strangers into your home when you were elderly and living on your own. Handbags get emptied, and worse than that. The young man went back down the garden path. His horse, a huge grey charger, big as a shire horse, its head high and its eyes intelligent, was tethered to Mrs. Whittaker's garden gate. The knight fumbled in the saddlebag and returned with a scroll. It was signed by Arthur, King of all Britons, and charged all persons of whatever rank or station to know that here was Galahad, Knight of the Table Round, and that he was on a right high and noble quest. There was a drawing of the young man below that. It wasn't a bad likeness. Mrs. Whittaker nodded. She had been expecting a little card with a photograph on it, but this was far more impressive. "I suppose you had better come in," she said. They went into her kitchen. She made Galahad a cup of tea, and she took him into the parlour. Galahad saw the Grail on her mantelpiece and dropped to one knee. He put down the teacup carefully on the russet carpet. A shaft of light came through the net curtains and painted his awed face with golden sunlight and turned his hair into a silver halo. "It is truly the Sangreal," he said, very quietly. He blinked his pale blue eyes 3 times, very fast, as if he were blinking back tears. He lowered his head, as if in silent prayer. Galahad stood up again and turned to Mrs. Whittaker. "Gracious lady, keeper of the Holy of Holies, let me now depart this place with the blessed chalice that my journeyings may be ended and my cares fulfilled." "Sorry," said Mrs. Whittaker. Galahad walked over to her and took her old hands in his. "My quest is over," he told her. "The Sangreal is finally within my reach." Mrs. Whittaker pursed her lips. "Can you pick your teacup and saucer up, please?" she said. Galahad picked up his teacup, apologetically. "No, I don't think so," said Mrs. Whittaker. "I rather like it there. It's just right between the dog and the photograph of my Henry." "Is it gold you need? Is that it? Lady, I can bring you gold." "No," said Mrs. Whittaker. "I don't want any gold, thank you. I'm simply not interested." She ushered Galahad to the front door. "Nice to meet you," she said. His horse was leaning its head over her garden fence, nibbling her gladioli. Several of the neighborhood children were standing on the pavement, watching it. Galahad took some sugar lumps from the saddlebag and showed the braver of the children how to feed the horse, their hands held flat. The children giggled. One of the older girls stroked the horse's nose. Galahad swung himself up onto the horse in one fluid movement. Then the horse and the knight trotted off down Hawthorne Crescent. Mrs. Whittaker watched them until they were out of sight, then sighed and went back inside. The weekend was quiet. On Saturday, Mrs. Whittaker took the bus into Maresfield to visit her nephew Ronald, his wife Euphonia, and their daughters Clarissa and Dillian. She took them a currant cake she had baked herself. On Sunday morning, Mrs. Whittaker went to church. Her local church was St. James the Less, which was a little more... Don't think of this as a church. Think of it as a place where like-minded friends hang out and are joyful. Then Mrs.
Okay,
Whittaker
I'm
felt
just gonna do
entirely
the
comfortable with
pomegranate.
that she liked the vicar, the Reverend Bartholomew, when he wasn't actually playing the guitar. After the service, she thought about mentioning to him that she had the Holy Grail in her front parlour, but decided against it. On Monday morning, Mrs. Whittaker was working in the back garden. She had a small herb garden she was extremely proud of. Dill, vervain, mint, rosemary, thyme, and a wild expanse of parsley. She was down on her knees, wearing thick green gardening gloves, weeding and picking out slugs and putting them in a plastic bag. Mrs. Whittaker was very tender-hearted when it came to slugs. She would take them down to the back of her garden, which bordered on the railway line, and throw them over the fence. She cut some parsley for the salad. There was a cough behind her. Galahad stood there, tall and beautiful, his armour glinting in the morning sun. In his arms he held a long package wrapped in oiled leather. "I'm back," he said. "Hello," said Mrs. Whittaker. She stood up rather slowly and took off her gardening gloves. "Well," she said, "now you're here, you might as well make yourself useful." She gave him the plastic bag full of slugs and told him to tip the slugs out over the back of the fence. He did. Then they went into the kitchen. "Tea or lemonade?" she asked. "Whatever you're having," Galahad said. Mrs. Whittaker took a jug of her homemade lemonade from the fridge and sent Galahad outside to pick a sprig of mint. She selected 2 tall glasses. She washed the mint carefully and put a few leaves in each glass, then poured the lemonade. "Is your horse outside?" she asked. "Oh, yes. His name is Grisel." "And you've come a long way, I suppose?" "A very long way." "I see," said Mrs. Whittaker. She took a blue plastic basin from under the sink and half filled it with water. Galahad took it out to Grisel. He waited while the horse drank and brought the empty basin back to Mrs. Whittaker. "Now," she said, "I suppose you're still after the Grail." "Aye, still do I seek the Sangreal," he said. He picked up the leather package from the floor, put it down on her tablecloth, and unwrapped it. "For it, I offer you this." It was a sword, its blade almost 4 feet long. There were words and symbols traced elegantly along the length of the blade. The hilt was worked in silver and gold, and a large jewel was set in the pommel. "It's very nice," said Mrs. Whittaker, doubtfully. "This," said Galahad, "is the sword Balmung, forged by Wayland Smith in the Dawn times. Its twin is Flamberge. Who wears it is unconquerable in war and invincible in battle. Who wears it is incapable of a cowardly act or an ignoble one. Set in its pommel is the sardonyx beer cone, which protects its possessor from poison slipped into wine or ale and from the treachery of friends." Mrs. Whittaker peered at the sword. "It must be very sharp," she said, after a while. "It can slice a falling hair in twain. Nay, it could slice a sunbeam," said Galahad proudly. "Well, then, maybe you ought to put it away," said Mrs. Whittaker. "Don't you want it?" Galahad seemed disappointed. "No, thank you," said Mrs. Whittaker. It occurred to her that her late husband, Henry, would have quite liked it. He would have hung it on the wall in his study, next to the stuffed carp he had caught in Scotland, and pointed it out to visitors. Galahad rewrapped the oiled leather around the sword Balmung and tied it up with white cord. He sat there disconsolate. Mrs. Whittaker made him some cream cheese and cucumber sandwiches for the journey back and wrapped them in greaseproof paper. She gave him an apple for Grisel. He seemed very pleased with both gifts. She waved them both goodbye. That afternoon, she took the bus down to the hospital to see Mrs. Perkins, who was still in with her hip, poor love. Mrs. Whittaker took her some homemade fruitcake, although she had left out the walnuts from the recipe because Mrs. Perkins's teeth weren't what they used to be. She watched a little television that evening and had an early night. On Tuesday, the postman called. Mrs. Whittaker was up in the box room at the top of the house, doing a spot of tidying, and, taking each step slowly and carefully, she didn't make it downstairs in time. The postman had left her a message which said that he tried to deliver a packet, but no one was home. Mrs. Whittaker sighed. She put the message into her handbag and went down to the post office. The package was from her niece, Sherelle, in Sydney, Australia. It contained photographs of her husband, Wallace, and her two daughters, Dixie and Violet, and a conch shell packed in cotton wool. Mrs. Whittaker had a number of ornamental shells in her bedroom. Her favourite had a view of the Bahamas done on it in enamel. It had been a gift from her sister Ethel, who had died in 1983. She put the shell and the photographs in her shopping bag. Then, seeing that she was in the area, she stopped in at the Oxfam shop on her way home. "Hello, Mrs. W," said Marie. Mrs. Whittaker stared at her. Marie was wearing lipstick. Possibly not the best shade for her, nor particularly expertly applied. But, thought Mrs. Whittaker, that would come with time. And a rather smart skirt. It was a great improvement. "Oh, hello, dear," said Mrs. Whittaker. "There was a man in here last week asking about that thing you bought, the little metal cup thing. I told him where to find you. You don't mind, do you?" "Oh, no, dear," said Mrs. Whittaker. "He found me. He was really dreamy. Really, really dreamy," sighed Marie, wistfully. "I could have gone for him. And he had a big white horse and all," Marie concluded. She was standing up straighter as well, Mrs. Whittaker noted approvingly. On the bookshelf, Mrs. Whittaker found a new Mills and Boon novel, Her Majestic Passion, although she hadn't yet finished the two she had bought on her last visit. She picked up the copy of Romance and Legend of Chivalry and opened it. It smelled musty. Ex Libris Fisher was neatly handwritten at the top of the first page, in red ink. She put it down where she had found it. When she got home, Galahad was waiting for her. He was giving the neighborhood children rides on Grizel's back, up and down the street. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I've got some cases that need moving." She showed him up to the box room at the top of the house. He moved all the old suitcases for her, so she could get to the cupboard at the back. It was very dusty up there. She kept him up there most of the afternoon, moving things around while she dusted. Galahad had a cut on his cheek, and he held one arm a little stiffly.
The mushroom shirt.
They talked a little while she dusted and tidied. Mrs. Whittaker told him about her late husband, Henry, and how the life insurance had paid the house off, and how she had all these things that no one really to leave them to, no one but Ronald really, and his wife only liked modern things. She told him how she'd met Henry during the war, when he was in the ARP, and she hadn't closed the kitchen blackout curtains all the way, and about the sixpenny dances they went to in the town, and how they'd gone to London when the war had ended, and she'd had her first drink of wine. Galahad told Mrs. Whittaker about his mother, Elaine, who was flighty and no better than she should have been, and something of a witch to boot, and his grandfather, King Pelles, who was well-meaning, although at best a little vague, and of his youth in the castle of Blyant on the Joyous Isle, and his father, whom he knew as Le Chevalier Malfait, who was more or less completely mad, and was in reality Lancelot du Lac, greatest of knights, in disguise and bereft of his wits, and of Galahad's days as a young squire in Camelot. At 5 o'clock, Mrs. Whittaker surveyed the box room and decided that it met with her approval. Then she opened the window so the room could air, and they went downstairs to the kitchen, where she put on the kettle. Galahad sat down at the kitchen table. He opened the leather purse at his waist and took out a round white stone. It was about the size of a cricket ball. "My lady," he said, "this is for you, and you give me the sand grail." Mrs. Whittaker picked up the stone, which was heavier than it looked, and held it up to the light. It was milkily translucent, and deep inside it flecks of silver glittered and glinted in the late afternoon sunlight. It was warm to the touch. Then, as she held it, a strange feeling crept over her. Deep inside, she felt stillness and a sort of peace. Serenity. That was the word for it. She felt serene. Reluctantly, she put the stone back on the table. "It's very nice," she said. "That is the philosopher's stone, which our forefather Noah hung in the ark to give light when there was no light. It can transform base metals into gold, and it has certain other properties," Galahad told her proudly. And that isn't all. There's more. Here." From the leather bag, he took an egg and handed it to her. It was the size of a goose egg and was a shiny black color, mottled with scarlet and white. When Mrs. Whittaker touched it, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Her immediate impression was one of incredible heat and freedom. She heard the crackling of distant fires, and for a fraction of a second she seemed to feel herself far above the world, swooping and diving on wings of flame. She put the egg down on the table, next to the philosopher's stone. "That is the egg of the phoenix," said Galahad. "From far Araby it comes. One day it will hatch out into the phoenix bird itself, and when its time comes, the bird will build a nest of flame, lay its egg, and die, to be reborn in flame in a later age of the world." "I thought that was what it was," said Mrs. Whittaker. "And last of all, lady," said Galahad, "I have brought you this." He drew it from his pouch and gave it to her. It was an apple, apparently carved from a single ruby on an amber stem. A little nervously, she picked it up. It was soft to the touch, deceptively so. Her fingers bruised it, and ruby-colored juice from the apple ran down Mrs. Whittaker's hand. The kitchen filled, almost imperceptibly, magically, with the smell of summer fruit, of raspberries and peaches and strawberries and red currants. As if from a great way away, she heard distant voices raised in song and far music on the air. "It is one of the apples of the Hesperides," said Galahad quietly. "One bite from it will heal any illness or wound, no matter how deep. A second bite restores youth and beauty, and a third bite is said to grant eternal life." Mrs. Whittaker licked the sticky juice from her hand. It tasted like fine wine. There was a moment then when it all came back to her. How it was to be young, to have a firm, slim body that would do whatever she wanted it to do, to run down a country lane for the simple, unladylike joy of running, to have men smile at her just because she was herself and happy about it. Mrs. Whittaker looked at Sir Galahad, most comely of all knights, sitting fair and noble in her small kitchen. She caught her breath. "And that's all I have brought for you," said Galahad. They weren't easy to get either. Mrs. Whittaker put the ruby fruit down on her kitchen table. She looked at the philosopher's stone, and the egg of the phoenix, and the apple of life. Then she walked into her parlour, and looked at the mantelpiece, at the little china basset hound, and the Holy Grail, and the photograph of her late husband Henry, shirtless, smiling and eating an ice cream in black and white, almost 40 years away. She went back into the kitchen. The kettle had begun to whistle. She poured a little steaming water into the teapot, swirled it around, and poured it out. Then she added 2 spoonfuls of tea, and 1 for the pot, and poured in the rest of the water. All this she did in silence. She turned to Galahad then, and she looked at him. "Put that apple away," she told Galahad firmly. "You shouldn't offer things like that to old ladies. It isn't proper." She paused then. "But I'll take the other 2, she continued after a moment's thought. "They'll look nice on the mantelpiece. And 2 for 1's fair, or I don't know what is." Galahad beamed. He put the ruby apple into his leather pouch. Then he went down on one knee and kissed Mrs. Whittaker's hand. "Stop that," said Mrs. Whittaker. She poured them both cups of tea, after getting out the very best china, which was only for special occasions. They sat in silence, drinking their tea. When they had finished their tea, they went into the parlour. Galahad crossed himself and picked up the grail. Mrs. Whittaker arranged the egg and the stone where the grail had been. The egg kept tipping on one side, and she propped it up against the little china dog. "They do look very nice," said Mrs. Whittaker. "Yes," agreed Galahad. "They look very nice." "Can I give you anything to eat before you go back?" she asked. He shook his head. "Some fruit cake," she said. "You may not think you want any now, but you'll be glad of it in a few hours' time. And you should probably use the facilities. Now, give me that, and I'll wrap it up for you." She directed him to the small toilet at the end of the hall, and went into the kitchen holding the grail. She had some old Christmas wrapping paper in the pantry, and she wrapped the grail in it and tied the package with twine. Then she cut a large slice of fruit cake and put it in a brown paper bag along with a banana and a slice of processed cheese in silver foil. Galahad came back from the toilet. She gave him the paper bag and the Holy Grail, and she went up on tiptoes and kissed him on the cheek. "You're a nice boy," she said. "You take care of yourself." He hugged her, and she shooed him out of the kitchen and out of the back door, and she shut the door behind him. She poured herself another cup of tea and cried, quietly, into a Kleenex, while the sound of hoofbeats echoed down Hawthorne Crescent. On Wednesday, Mrs. Whittaker stayed in all day. On Thursday, she went down to the post office to collect her pension, and she stopped in at the Oxfam shop. The woman on the till was new to her. "Where's Marie?" asked Mrs. Whittaker. The woman on the till, who had blue-rinsed grey hair and blue spectacles that went up into diamante points, shook her head and shrugged her shoulders. "She went off with a young man," she said, "on a horse." "I ask you. I meant to be down in the Heathfield shop this afternoon. I had to get my Johnny to run me up here while we find someone else." "Oh," said Mrs. Whittaker. "Well, it's nice that she's found herself a young man." "Nice for her, maybe," said the lady on the till. "But some of us were meant to be in Heathfield this afternoon." On a shelf near the back of the shop, Mrs. Whittaker found a tarnished old silver container with a long spout. It had been priced at 60p, according to the little paper label stuck to the side. It looked a little like a flattened, elongated teapot. She picked out a Mills and Boon novel she hadn't read before. It was called Her Singular Love.
Shit.
She took the book in the silver
I don't know if
container
people
up to the
can
woman on
see
the till.
this.
65p, dear, said the woman, picking up the silver object, staring at it. "Funny old thing, isn't it? Came in this morning." It had writing carved along the side, in blocky old Chinese characters, and an elegant arching handle. "Some kind of oil can, I suppose." "No, it's not an oil can," said Mrs. Whittaker, who knew exactly what it was. "It's a lamp." There was a small metal finger ring, unornamented, tied to the handle of the lamp with brown twine. "Actually," said Mrs. Whittaker, "on second thoughts, I think I'll just have the book." She paid her 5p for the novel, and put the lamp back where she had found it, in the back of the shop. After all, Mrs. Whittaker reflected as she walked home, it wasn't as if she had anywhere to put it. Nicholas was older than sin, and his beard could grow no whiter. He wanted to die. The dwarfish natives of the Arctic caverns did not speak his language, but conversed in their own twittering tongue, conducted incomprehensible rituals when they were not actually working in the factories. Once every year, they forced him, sobbing and protesting, into endless night. During the journey, he would stand near every child in the world, leave one of the dwarves' invisible gifts by its bedside. The children slept, frozen into time. He envied Prometheus and Loki, Sisyphus and Judas. His punishment was harsher. Oh, oh, oh. The price. Tramps and vagabonds have marks they make on gateposts and trees and doors, letting others of their kind know a little about the people who live at the houses and farms they pass on their travels. I think cats must leave similar signs. How else to explain the cats who turn up at our door through the year, hungry and flea-ridden and abandoned? We take them in. We get rid of the fleas and the ticks, feed them, and take them to the vet. We pay for them to get their shots, and indignity upon indignity, we have them neutered or spayed. And they stay with us for a few months, or for a year, or forever. Most of them arrive in summer. We live in the country, just the right distance out of town for the city dwellers to abandon their cats near us. We never seem to have more than 8 cats, rarely have less than 3. The cat population of my house is currently as follows. Hermione and Pod, Tabby and Black respectively, the mad sisters who live in my attic office and do not mingle. Snowflake, the blue-eyed, long-haired white cat who lived wild in the woods for years before she gave up her wild ways for soft sofas and beds. And last but largest, Furball, Snowflake's cushion-like calico long-haired daughter, orange and black and white, whom I discovered as a tiny kitten in our garage one day, strangled and almost dead, her head poked through an old badminton net, and who surprised us all by not dying, but instead growing up to be the best-natured cat I have ever encountered. And then there is the black cat, who has no other name than the Black Cat, and who turned up almost a month ago. We did not realize he was going to be living here at first. He looked too well fed to be a stray, too old and jaunty to have been abandoned. He looked like a small panther, and he moved like a patch of night. One day, in the summer, he was lurking about our ramshackle porch, 8 or 9 years old at a guess, male, greenish-yellow of eye, very friendly, quite unperturbable. I assumed he belonged to a neighboring farmer or household. I went away for a few weeks to finish writing a book, and when I came home, he was still on our porch, living in an old cat bed one of the children had found for him. He was, however, almost unrecognizable. Patches of fur had gone, and there were deep scratches on his grey skin. The tip of one ear was chewed away. There was a gash beneath one eye, a slice gone from one lip. He looked tired and thin. We took the black cat to the vet, where we got him some antibiotics, which we fed him each night, along with soft cat food. We wondered who he was fighting. Snowflake, our beautiful white near-feral queen? Raccoons? A rat-tailed fanged possum? Each night the scratches would be worse. One night his side would be chewed up. The next it would be his underbelly, raked with claw marks and bloody to the touch. When it got to that point, I took him down to the basement to recover beside the furnace and the piles of boxes. He was surprisingly heavy, the black cat, and I picked him up and carried him down there with a cat basket and a litter box and some food and water. I closed the door behind me. I had to wash the blood from my hands when I left the basement. He stayed down there for 4 days. At first he seemed too weak to feed himself. A cut beneath one eye had rendered him almost one-eyed, and he limped and lolled weakly, thick yellow pus oozing from the cut in his lip. I went down there every morning and every night, and I fed him and gave him antibiotics, which I mixed with his canned food, and I dabbed at the worst of the cuts and spoke to him. He had diarrhea, and although I changed his litter daily, the basement stank evilly. The 4 days that the black cat lived in the basement were a bad 4 days in the house.
Oops.
The baby slipped slipped in the bath and banged her
Okay.
head.
Let's try this again.
To the project I had set my heart on, adapting Hope Merley's novel Blood in the Mist for the BBC, was no longer going to happen. And I realized that I did not have the energy to begin again from scratch, pitching it to other networks or to other media. My daughter left for summer camp and immediately began to send home a plethora of heart-tearing letters and cards, 5 or 6 each day, imploring us to bring her home. My son had some kind of fight with his best friend, to the point that they were no longer on speaking terms. And returning home one night, my wife hit a deer, then ran out in front of the car. The deer was killed, the car was left undrivable, and my wife sustained a small cut over one eye. By the 4th day, the cat was prowling the basement, walking haltingly but impatiently between the stacks of books and comics, the boxes of mail and cassettes, of pictures and of gifts and of stuff. He mewed at me to let him out, and reluctantly I did so. He went back onto the porch and slept there for the rest of the day. The next morning, there were deep new gashes in his flanks, and clumps of black cat hair. His covered the wooden boards of the porch. Letters arrived that day from my daughter, telling us that camp was going better, and she thought she could survive a few days. My son and his friends sorted out their problem, although what the argument was about, trading cards, computer games, Star Wars, or a girl, I would never learn. The BBC executive, who had vetoed Blood in the Mist, was discovered to have been taking bribes. Well, quote, questionable loans from an independent production company, and was sent home on permanent leave. His successor, I was delighted to learn when she faxed me, was the woman who had initially proposed the project to me before leaving the BBC. I thought about returning the black cat to the basement, but decided against it. Instead, I resolved to try and discover what kind of animal was coming to our house each night, and from there to formulate a plan of action. To trap it, perhaps. For birthdays and at Christmas, my family gives me gadgets and gizmos, pricey toys which excite my fancy but ultimately rarely leave their boxes. There is a food dehydrator and an electric carving knife, a bread-making machine, and last year's present, a pair of see-in-the-dark binoculars. On Christmas Day, I had put the batteries into the binoculars and had walked about the basement in the dark, too impatient even to wait until nightfall, stalking a flock of imaginary starlings. You were warned not to turn it on in the light. That would have damaged the binoculars and quite possibly your eyes as well. Afterward, I'd put the device back into its box, and it sat there in my office beside the box of computer cables and forgotten bits and pieces. Perhaps, I thought, if the creature, dog or cat or raccoon or what have you, were to see me sitting on the porch, it would not come. So I took a chair into the box and coat room, little larger than a closet which overlooks the porch, and when everyone in the house was asleep, I went out onto the porch and bade the black cat good night. That cat, my wife had said, when he first arrived, is a person. And there was something very person-like in his huge leonine face, his broad black nose, his greenish-yellow eyes, his fanged but amiable mouth, still leaking amber pus from the right lower lip. I stroked his head and scratched him beneath the chin and wished him well. Then I went inside and turned off the light on the porch. I sat on my chair in the darkness inside the house with the see-in-the-dark binoculars on my lap. I had switched the binoculars on, and a trickle of greenish light came from the eyepieces. Time passed in the darkness. I experimented with looking at the darkness with the binoculars, learning to focus, to see the world in shades of green. I found myself horrified by the number of swarming insects I could see in the night air. It was as if the night world was some kind of nightmarish soup swimming with life. And I lowered the binoculars from my eyes and stared out at the rich blacks and blues of the night. empty and peaceful and calm. Time passed. I struggled to keep awake, found myself profoundly missing cigarettes and coffee, my two lost addictions. Either of them would have kept my eyes open. But before I had tumbled too far into the world of sleep and dreams, a yowl from the garden jerked me fully awake. I fumbled the binoculars to my eyes and was disappointed to see that it was merely Snowflake, the white cat, streaking across the front garden like a patch of greenish-white light. She vanished into the woodland to the left of the house and was gone. I was about to settle myself back down when it occurred to me to wonder what exactly had startled Snowflake so, and I began scanning the middle distance with the binoculars looking for a huge raccoon, a dog, or a vicious possum. And there was indeed something coming down the driveway toward the house. I could see it through the binoculars, clear as day. It was the devil. I had never seen the devil before, and although I had written about him in the past, if pressed, would have confessed that I had no belief in him, other than as an imaginary figure, tragic and Miltonian. The figure coming up the driveway was not Milton's Lucifer. It was the devil. My heart began to pound in my chest, to pound so hard that it hurt. I hoped it could not see me, that in a dark house behind window glass I was hidden. The figure flickered and changed as it walked up the drive. One moment it was dark, bull-like, minotaurish. The next it was slim and female, and the next it was a cat itself, a scarred, huge, grey-green wildcat, its face contorted with hate. There are steps that lead up to my porch. 4 white wooden steps in need of a coat of paint. I knew they were white, although they were, like everything else, green through my binoculars. At the bottom of the steps, the devil stopped and called out something that I could not understand. 3, perhaps 4 words in a whining, howling language that must have been old and forgotten when Babylon was young. And although I did not understand the words, I felt the hairs raise on the back of my head as it called. And then I heard, muffled through the glass but still audible, a low growl, a challenge. And slowly, unsteadily, a black figure walked down the steps of the house away from me toward the devil. These days, the black cat no longer moved like a panther. Instead, he stumbled and rocked like a sailor only recently returned to land. The devil was a woman now. She said something soothing and gentle to the cat in a tongue that sounded like French and reached out a hand to him. He sank his teeth into her arm and her lip curled. She spat at him. The woman glanced up at me then, and if I had doubted that she was the devil before, I was certain of it now. The woman's eyes flashed red fire at me, but you can see no red through the night vision binoculars, only shades of green. And the devil saw me through the window. It saw me. I am in no doubt about that at all. The devil twisted and writhed, and now it was some kind of jackal, a flat-faced, huge-headed, bull-necked creature, halfway between a hyena and a dingo. There were maggots squirming in its mangy fur, and it began to walk up the steps. The black cat leapt upon it, and in seconds they became a rolling, writhing thing, moving faster than my eyes could follow. All this in silence. And then a low roar. Down the country road at the bottom of our drive in the distance lumbered a late-night truck, its blazing headlights burning bright as green suns through the binoculars. I lowered them from my eyes and saw only darkness and the gentle yellow of headlights, and then the red of rear lights as it vanished off again into the nowhere at all. When I raised the binoculars once more, there was nothing to be seen. Only the black cat on the steps, staring up into the air. I trained the binoculars up and saw something flying away. A vulture, perhaps, or an eagle. And then it flew beyond the trees and was gone. I went out onto the porch and picked up the black cat and stroked him and said kind, soothing things to him mewled piteously when I first approached him, but after a while, he went to sleep on my lap.
Okay, done with the
I put him into
mushroom
his
shirt.
basket
Now
and
one
went
more shirt.
upstairs to my bed
The spider
to sleep
shirt.
myself.
This
There was dried blood on my t-shirt and
pretty
jeans
cool.
the following morning. That was a week ago. The thing that comes to my house does not come every night, but it comes most nights. We know it by the wounds on the cat and the pain I can see in those leonine eyes. He has lost the use of his front left paw, and his right eye has closed for good. I wonder what we did to deserve the black cat. I wonder who sent him. And, selfish and scared, I wonder how much more he has to give. Trollbridge. They pulled up most of the railway tracks in the early 60s, when I was 3 or 4. They slashed the train services to ribbons. This meant that there was nowhere to go but London, and the little town where I lived became the end of the line. My earliest reliable memory, 18 months old, my mother away in hospital having my sister, and my grandmother walking with me down to a bridge and lifting me up to watch the train below, panting and steaming like a black iron dragon. Over the next few years, they lost the last of the steam trains, and with them went the network of railways that joined village to village, town to town. I didn't know that the trains were going. By the time I was 7, they were a thing of the past. We lived in an old house on the outskirts of the town. The fields opposite were empty and fallow. I used to climb the fence and lie in the shade of a small bulrush patch and read. Or if I were feeling more adventurous, I'd explore the grounds of the empty manor beyond the fields. It had a weed-clogged ornamental pond, with a low wooden bridge over it. I never saw any groundsmen or caretakers in my forays through the gardens and woods, and I never attempted to enter the manor. That would have been courting disaster, and besides, it was a matter of faith for me that all empty old houses were haunted. It is not that I was credulous, simply that I believed in all things dark and dangerous. It was part of my young creed that the night was full of ghosts and witches, hungry and flapping and dressed completely in black. The converse held reassuringly true. Daylight was safe. Daylight was always safe. A ritual. On the last day of the summer school term, walking home from school, I would remove my shoes and socks and, carrying them in my hands, walk down the stony, flinty lane on pink and tender feet. In the summer holiday, I would put shoes on only under duress until school term began once more in September. When I was 7, I discovered the path through the wood. It was summer, hot and bright, and I wandered a long way from home that day. I was exploring. I went past the manor, its windows boarded up and blind, across the grounds, and through some unfamiliar woods. I scrambled down a steep bank, and I found myself on a shady path that was new to me and overgrown with trees. The light that penetrated the leaves was stained green and gold, and I thought I was in fairyland. A tiny stream trickled down the side of the path, teeming with tiny, transparent shrimps. I picked them up and watched them jerk and spin on my fingertips. Then I put them back. I wandered down the path. It was perfectly straight and overgrown with short grass. From time to time, I would find these really terrific rocks, bubbly, melted things, brown and purple and black. If you held them up to the light, you could see every color of the rainbow. I was convinced that they had to be extremely valuable, and stuffed my pockets with them. I walked and walked down the quiet, golden-green corridor, and saw nobody. I wasn't hungry or thirsty. I just wondered where the path was going. It traveled in a straight line and was flat, sometimes at the bottom of a ravine, occasionally built up. So I'd look down on treetops and occasional houses, valleys and plateaux, valleys and plateaux. And eventually, in one of the valleys, I came to the bridge. It was built of clean red brick, a huge, curving arch over the path. At the side of the bridge were stone steps cut into the embankment, and at the top of the steps, a little wooden gate. I was surprised to see any token of the existence of humanity on my path, which I was by now convinced was a natural formation like a volcano. And, with a sense more of curiosity than anything else, I had, after all, walked hundreds of miles, so I was convinced, and might be anywhere. I climbed the stone steps and went through the gate. I was nowhere. The top of the bridge was paved with mud. On each side of it was a meadow. The meadow on my side was a cornfield. The other field was just grass. There were the caked imprints of huge tractor wheels in the dried mud. I walked across the bridge to be sure. No trip-trap. My bare feet were soundless. Nothing for miles. Just fields and corn and trees. I picked an ear of wheat and pulled out the sweet grains, peeling them between my fingers, chewing them meditatively. I realized then that I was getting hungry and went back down the stairs to the abandoned railway track. It was time to go home. I was not lost. All I needed to do was follow my path home once more. There was a troll waiting for me under the bridge. "I'm a troll," he said. Then he paused and added, more or less as an afterthought, "Bol roll de old roll." He was huge. His head brushed the top of the brick arch. He was more or less translucent. I could see the bricks and trees behind him, dimmed but not lost. He was all my nightmares given flesh. He had huge, strong teeth and rending claws and strong, hairy hands. His hair was long, like one of my sister's little plastic gonks, and his eyes bulged. He was naked, and his penis hung from the bush of gonk hair between his legs. "I heard you, Jack," he whispered, in a voice like the wind. "I heard you trip-trapping over my bridge, and now I'm going to eat your life." I was only 7, but it was daylight, and I do not remember being scared. It is good for children to find themselves facing the elements of a fairy tale. They are well equipped to deal with these. "Don't eat me," I said to the troll. I was wearing a stripy brown t-shirt and brown corduroy trousers. My hair also was brown, and I was missing a front tooth. I was learning to whistle between my teeth, but wasn't there yet. "I'm going to eat your life, Jack," said the troll. I stared the troll in the face. "My big sister is going to be coming down the path soon," I lied. "And she's far tastier than me. Eat her instead." The troll sniffed the air and smiled. "You're all alone," he said. "There's nothing else on the path. Nothing at all." Then he leaned down and ran his fingers over me. It felt like butterflies were brushing my face, like the touch of a blind person. Then he snuffled his fingers and shook his huge head. "You don't have a big sister. You've only a younger sister, and she's at her friends today." "Can you tell all that from smell?" I asked, amazed. "Trolls can smell the rainbows. Trolls can smell the stars," it whispered, sadly. "Trolls can smell the dreams you dreamed before you were ever born. Come close to me, and I'll eat your life." I've got precious stones in my pocket," I told the troll. "Take them, not me. Look." I showed him the lava jewel rocks I'd found earlier. "Clinker," said the troll. "A discarded refuse of steam trains, of no value to me." He opened his mouth wide. Sharp teeth. Breath that smelled of leaf mold and the underneaths of things. "Eat. Now," He became more and more solid to me, more and more real. The world outside became flatter, began to fade. Wait! I dug my feet into the damp earth beneath the bridge, wiggled my toes, hung on tightly to the real world. I stared into his big eyes. You don't want to eat my life? Not yet. I'm only 7. I haven't lived at all yet. There are books I haven't read yet. I've never been on an aeroplane. I can't whistle yet. Not really. Why don't you let me go? When I'm older and bigger and more of a meal, I'll come back to you. The troll stared at me, with eyes like headlamps. Then it nodded. When you come back, then, it said. It smiled. I turned around and walked back down the silent, straight path where the railway lines had once been. After a while, I began to run. I pounded down the track in the green light, puffing and blowing until I felt a stabbing ache beneath my ribcage, the pain of stitch, and, clutching my side, I stumbled home. The field started to go as I grew older. One by one, row by row, houses sprang up with roads named after wildflowers and respectable authors. Our home, an aging, tattered Victorian house, was sold and torn down. New houses covered the garden. They built houses everywhere. I once got lost in the new housing estate that covered 2 meadows I'd once known every inch of. I didn't mind too much that the fields were going, though. The old manor house was bought by a multinational, and the grounds became more houses. It was 8 years before I returned to the old railway line, and when I did, I was not alone. I was 15. I'd changed schools twice in that time. Her name was Louise, and she was my first love. I loved her grey eyes, and her fine light brown hair, and her gawky way of walking, like a fawn just learning to walk, which sounds really dumb, for which I apologize. I saw her chewing gum when I was 13, and I fell for her like a suicide from a bridge. And the main trouble with being in love with Louise was that we were best friends, and we were both going out with other people. I'd never told her I loved her, or even that I fancied her. We were buddies. I'd been at her house that evening. We sat in her room and played Rattus Norvegicus, the first Stranglers LP. It was the beginning of punk, and everything seemed so exciting. The possibilities in music, as in everything else, were endless. Eventually, it was time for me to go home, and she decided to accompany me. We held hands innocently, just pals, and we strolled the 10-minute walk to my house. The moon was bright, and the world was visible and colourless, and the night was warm. We got to my house, saw the lights inside, and stood in the driveway and talked about the band I was starting. We didn't go in. Then it was decided that I'd walk her home, so we walked back to her house. She told me about the battles she was having with her younger sister, who was stealing her makeup and perfume. Louise suspected that her sister was having sex with boys. Louise was a virgin. We both were. We stood in the road outside her house under the sodium yellow streetlight, and we stared at each other's black lips and pale yellow faces. We grinned at each other, and then we just walked, picking quiet roads and empty paths. In one of the new housing estates, a path led us into the woodland, and we followed it. The path was straight and dark, but the lights of distant houses shone like stars on the ground, and the moon gave us light enough to see. Once we were scared when something snuffled and snorted in front of us. We pressed close, saw it was a badger, laughed and hugged, and kept on walking. We talked quiet nonsense about what we dreamed and wanted and thought. And all the time I wanted to kiss her, and feel her breasts, and maybe put my hand between her legs. Finally, I saw my chance. There was an old brick bridge over the path, and we stopped beneath it. I pressed up against her. Her mouth opened against mine. Then she went cold and stiff, and stopped moving. "Hello," said the troll. I let go of Louise. It was dark beneath the bridge, but the shape of the troll filled the darkness. I froze her, said the troll, so we can talk. Now, I'm going to eat your life. My heart pounded and I could feel myself trembling. No. You said you'd come back to me. And you have. Did you learn to whistle? Yes. That's good. I never could whistle. It sniffed and nodded. I am pleased. You have grown in life and experience. More to eat. More for me. I grabbed Louise, a taut zombie, and pushed her forward. Don't take me. I don't want to die. Take her. I bet she's much tastier than me. And she's 2 months older than I am. Why don't you take her? The troll was silent. It sniffed Louise from toe to head, snuffling at her feet and crotch and breasts and hair. Then it looked at me. She's an innocent, it said. You're not. I don't want her. I want you. I walked to the opening of the bridge and stared up at the stars in the night. But there's so much I've never done, I said, partly to myself. I mean, I've never had sex. And I've never been to America. I paused. I haven't done anything. Not yet. The troll said nothing. I could come back to you when I'm older. The troll said nothing. I will come back. Honest, I will. Come back to me, said Louise. Why? Where are you going? I turned around. The troll had gone, and the girl I had thought I loved was standing in the shadows beneath the bridge. We're going home, I told her. Come on. We walked back and never said anything. She went out with the drummer in the punk band I started and, much later, married someone else. We met once on a train after she was married, and she asked me if I remembered that night. I said I did. I really liked you that night, Jack, she told me. I thought you were going to kiss me. I thought you were going to ask me out. I would have said yes, if you had. But I didn't. No, she said. You didn't. Her hair was cut very short. It didn't suit her. I never saw her again. The trim woman with the taut smile was not the girl I had loved. And talking to her made me feel uncomfortable. I moved to London, and then, some years later, I moved back again. But the town I returned to was not the town I remembered. There were no fields, no farms, no little flint lanes. And I moved away as soon as I could to a tiny village, 10 miles down the road. I moved with my family. I was married now, with a toddler. Into an old house that had once, many years before, been a railway station. The tracks had been dug up, and the old couple who lived opposite us used it to grow vegetables. I was getting older. One day I found a grey hair. On another, I heard a recording of myself talking and realized I sounded just like my father. I was working in London, doing A&R for one of the major record companies. I was commuting into London by train most days, coming back some evenings. I had to keep a small flat in London. It's hard to commute when the bands you're checking out don't even stagger onto the stage until midnight. It also meant that it was fairly easy to get laid if I wanted to, which I did. I thought that Eleonora, that was my wife's name. I should have mentioned that before, I suppose. Didn't know about the other women. But I got back from a 2-week jaunt to New York one winter's day. And when I arrived at the house, it was empty and cold. She'd left a letter, not a note. 15 pages neatly typed, and every word of it was true, including the P.S., which read, "You really don't love me, and you never did." I put on a heavy coat and I left the house and just walked, stunned and slightly numb. There was no snow on the ground, but there was a hard frost, and the leaves crunched under my feet as I walked. The trees were skeletal black against the harsh grey winter sky. I walked down the side of the road. Cars passed me, travelling to and from London. Once I tripped on a branch, half hidden in a heap of brown leaves, ripping my trousers, cutting my leg. I reached the next village. There was a river at right angles to the road, and a path I'd never seen before beside it. And I walked down the path and stared at the river, partly frozen. It gurgled and plashed and sang. The path led off through fields. It was straight and grassy. I found a rock half buried on one side of the path. I picked it up, brushed off the mud. It was a melted lump of purplish stuff with a strange rainbow sheen to it. I put it into the pocket of my coat and held it in my hand as I walked, its presence warm and reassuring. The river meandered away across the fields, and I walked on in silence. I'd walked for an hour before I saw houses, new and small and square, on the embankment above me. And then I saw the bridge and knew where I was. I was on the old railway path, and I'd been coming down it from the other direction. There were graffiti painted on the side of the bridge. Fuck and Barry loves Susan, and the omnipresent NF of the National Front. I stood beneath the bridge in the red brick arch, stood among the ice cream wrappers and the crisp packets and the single sad used condom, and watched my breath steam in the cold afternoon air. The blood had dried into my trousers. Cars passed over the bridge above me. I could hear a radio playing loudly in one of them. "Hello?" I said quietly, feeling embarrassed, feeling foolish. "Hello?" There was no answer. The wind rustled the crisp packets and the leaves. I came back. I said I would. And I did. "Hello?" Silence. I began to cry then, stupidly, silently, sobbing under the bridge. A hand touched my face, and I looked up. "I didn't think you'd come back," said the troll. He was my height now, but otherwise unchanged. His long, gaunt hair was unkempt and had leaves in it, and his eyes were wide and lonely. I shrugged and wiped my face with the sleeve of my coat. I came back. 3 kids passed above us on the bridge, shouting and running. I'm a troll," whispered the troll in a small, scared voice. "Oh, roll the old roll." He was trembling. I held out my hand and took his huge clawed paw in mine. I smiled at him. "It's okay," I told him. "Honestly, it's okay." The troll nodded. He pushed me to the ground, onto the leaves and the wrappers and the condom, and lowered himself on top of me. And he raised his head and opened his mouth, and ate my life with his strong, sharp teeth. When he was finished, the troll stood up and brushed himself down. He put his hand into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a bubbly, burnt lump of clinker rock. He held it out to me. "This is yours," said the troll. I looked at him, wearing my life comfortably, easily, as if he'd been wearing it for years. I took the clinker from his hand and sniffed it. I could smell the train from which it had fallen so long ago. I gripped it tightly in my hairy hand. "Thank you," I said. "Good luck," said the troll. "Yeah, well, you too." The troll grinned with my face. It turned its back on me and began to walk back the way I
Spider
had come,
shirt is
toward the village,
done.
back to the
I'm
empty
gonna
house
dye
I
it.
left that morning, and it whistled as it walked. I've been here ever since, hiding, waiting, out of the bridge. I watch from the shadows as the people pass, walking their dogs, talking, or doing the things that people do.
Alright, thank you for
Sometimes people
watching.
pause beneath my bridge to stand or piss or make
I
love.
cannot see
And
any
I watch them, but say nothing. And they never see me.
comments.
Oh,
Anyway,
roll,
okay.
roll. I'm just gonna stay here, in the darkness under the arch. I can hear you all out there, trip-trapping over my bridge. Oh,